Hey everyone, Simon Walker here. I'm going to show you how to get started with Primatte Keyer 5. Primatte Keyer is an industry standard chroma key tool. It's been used on lots of high profile movies and TV shows, and this is for a reason. It uses some pretty sophisticated maths to generate keys and clean up mattes, smooth edges, and composite shots into scenes. But it also has tools that automate some of these processes, especially with some of the new tools in version 5. So as well as giving you pro results, it speeds up the process. I'm using After Effects CS 5.5, and the plugin is cross-platform, so it'll work in After Effects on both Mac and Windows, but it also works in Final Cut Pro 7 and in Motion 4. I'm working with some footage which was filmed at Orion Media in Australia for the Holomatrix commercial, and I'm going to composite our heroine into this science fiction themed corridor scene. So to apply Primatte, I go up to the effects menu and choose Primatte Keyer. I'll just close up some of these disclosure triangles in the interface. It's easier to see now that Primatte has four main sections, which are pre-processing, keying, adjusting the alpha, and then compositing the key with the background. So this is more than just a simple keying filter. These are all the steps you need to make a professional key, all within a single plugin. Here's an example of the sort of intelligent processing Primatte does. The first control in the list allows you to remove compression artifacts from source material. These artifacts often can cause problems when you're keying objects with soft edges, things like hair or smoke, or with objects that have a lot of motion blur. You just choose the setting that matches your footage, say if it was shot on DVCam or HDV, or on HDCam, or choose Other if you've got footage shot on a heavily compressed format, like H.264. It'll then analyze the footage and go about smoothing out any artifacts and edges in the shot. You can use the strength slider to determine how much image correction is applied to your shot. Here's a practical example of the de-artifacting that Primatte does. This is footage that was shot on HDV, which has quite visible blocking, especially around the edges of the subject. These are the two images to look at, the before and after. On the left is without de-artifacting, and on the right is with Primatte's de-artifacting algorithm enabled, which has got a visibly much smoother edge. It's this pre-processing ability that allows you to get a superior key. By the way, these images are from the help documentation that comes with Primatte. I'm looking at the section called De-artifacting Group. Actually, the documentation is well worth looking at, because it goes into detail about all the settings in the plugin, including a step-by-step tutorial which guides you through the whole keying process. From pulling the original key and tidying it up and performing fine-tuning tweaks, to removing light spill on the subject, and right down at the bottom of the page, using light wrap to get a better final composite. Okay, I'm going to flip back over to After Effects. So to pull a key, you need to sample areas of the video to define as the background color, so Primatte can then generate a matte. Inside the selection area, there are four tools which control the selection. These selection tools are pretty much the heart of Primatte Keyer. It's with these tools that you'll perform most of the extraction functions. So make sure Select Background is highlighted and the whole effect itself is also selected, and then you can click and drag on the background green in the shot itself. You can use the sampling style drop down to choose either a rectangle or a point. Sometimes it's useful to sample pixels using a rectangle. This samples all the pixels within that rectangular area rather than just one point. I like to use the point sampling method, as you can either click just once to select a single pixel, or click and drag the mouse to select multiple pixels in a single mouse movement. So I can click and drag on the green in this shot and select multiple points. This means I can drag around the shape of the subject and sample a series of pixels right next to her. You need to be careful just to make sure you don't sample any of the foreground area when you're doing this process. Okay, the next stage is to have a look at the matte you've generated, which you can do by choosing Matte from the View drop-down control. It's useful to be able to switch between these different views. Comp displays the final composite, whilst Matte shows the current generated matte. You can also choose between these different views according to what you're doing. I'll come back to these two. These two are new: Adjust Light Foreground and Hybrid Matte. The aim of a key is to get the matte solid white with the background solid black. Anything black will be completely transparent, whilst anything grey will be semi-transparent, depending on how grey it is. This is why the composite looks odd when I'm viewing it in comp mode, because the matte has got lots of grey areas in it, and that's why we can see some of the background showing through. That's the next thing we're going to fix using the rest of the selection tools. This background plate was actually quite well shot, and it's got a uniform colour. If you've got a background that's unevenly lit, this can show up as grey noise when it's keyed, but you can fix this using the Clean Background tool. You sample areas in the background in the same way that you use the Select Background tool, by clicking and dragging. In fact, even though the background is quite clean in this case, sampling it a few times helps Primatte work out which is the foreground and which is the background, and this often helps to refine the matte. This is working really well on a clean background plate, but what if the green screen you're working with doesn't have a uniform colour? Orion Media, who shot this background plate, do a lot of green screen filming, so they get their backgrounds looking really good. But we asked them if they'd mind sending over a few examples that weren't shot perfectly, that were deliberately shot incorrectly, so we could test them out using Primatte. This is one of the imperfect examples they let us have, which has an unbalanced background. It's much brighter on the right-hand side than on the left. They deliberately set this up so that the lighting wasn't uniform. So I'm going to pull a key in the same way as I did on the previous shot by using the Select Background tool with a point sampling style, sampling a series of points from the background, and then switching over to the matte view. This is what bad lighting does to your key. It creates these areas of grey in the matte, which are semi-transparent, and we want the background to be completely black, to be completely transparent. Now I can switch over to the Clean Background tool, and it's a question of sampling the background, drawing over these grey areas until I've helped Primatte calculate what is the background and what is the foreground. It's an interactive process and it depends on the footage you're working with, but within a few samples you can remove these grey areas, which also helps to define the foreground matte. Now using Clean Foreground, I can click and drag over the grey areas until the majority of the foreground matte is solid white. Clean Foreground is essentially the opposite of Clean Background, letting you sample pixels in the video that you know to be the foreground area. For both Clean Background and Clean Foreground, the regions you sample should be regions that are supposed to be completely foreground or completely background. Again, it's an interactive process, and I may need to switch back to the Clean Background tool to remove any grey areas, but by sampling the foreground and the background with each of these tools, I'm helping Primatte calculate the matte. I'll come back to the fine-tuning tools in a minute, but a great tool to use together with the Clean Foreground and Background tools is the Matte Sponge tool in the Corrections set of tools. This works in a very similar way, and it allows me to define the matte a little more by just dragging on any grey areas in the foreground until the matte turns solid white. These three tools work very nicely together, and it's quite intuitive to essentially just drag on the grey areas I want to remove, whether they're in the foreground or the background. One more thing I'd probably do at this stage is to draw a garbage matte or garbage mask around the subject to remove the lighting stand and boom mic and any extra items I don't want in the shot. Then I'm ready to move on to using the fine-tuning tools and the tools in the other sections to improve the matte, and to start to composite my image into the scene. But there's one more thing I want to mention about unevenly lit backgrounds, which is a new feature in Primatte 5. I'll just reset the filter and delete the mask. Right, this button, the Adjust Light On-Off button, is really useful if your background isn't uniform. I'll switch it on and then go through the same procedure of using the Select Background tool to choose a range of green points from the background. Now when I switch over to the Matte tool, have a look at the background. There's very little of that grey light spill. That's because Primatte is intelligently smoothing out the variance of the lighting in the background. Here's what it looks like with and without the Adjust Light feature switched on. This is a really useful feature. It makes adjusting the background much easier. I'll come back to Adjust Light shortly and show how you can preview what the adjusted background actually looks like. Firstly though, I want to show you a shortcut, how you can set up these mattes really quickly. I'm going to flip back over to my first example and reset the filter. Now let me show you the quick way to do it. And that's using the Auto Compute tool. Auto Compute automates the process of selecting the foreground image and separating it from the background color. Primatte Keyer 5 has a new foreground detection routine with a new smart sampling algorithm which speeds up the process and performs a more accurate background removal. So with one click I've got my matte set up. I can then go on to use the fine-tuning tools in the selection area. Actually, there are more tools to use in the correction area and even more tools in the refinements area. And this is the point. This is why Primatte is used for professional work. It's because of the amount of tools it has to be able to fix and fine-tune settings and get the perfect key. So what's the difference between these various tools? Well, the fine-tuning tools in the selection area are useful for adjusting keys of smoke or glass or fine hair strands. The correction tools allow you to select and remove green spill from the background using the spill sponge and also help to eliminate any transparent pixels in the matte, as well as being able to adjust the edge color of the matte and its size and the amount you can defocus it. The Restore Detail and Decrease Opacity tools are especially useful for recovering details that typically get lost in the keying process, like hair and smoke. Whilst the refinement tools allow you to adjust in even more detail the density of any spill colour as well as the density of the matte. Which set of tools you use largely depends on the type of footage you've got and the sorts of problems with the key. The point is that there are lots of ways you can solve problems whilst staying within Primatte. Even with all these tools, there are sometimes small problems that are tricky to fix. In my case here, there are some errant grey pixels around our heroine's eyes. These are tricky to select, and I could experiment with using some of the correction and refinement tools to get rid of these grey pixels, to make them solid white, but I'm always aware of the clock ticking. So it'd be nice to be able to fix all of these problems, all these pixels in one go without having to attack each one separately. This is where the alpha controls can help you work faster. The alpha cleaner helps you to eliminate grain or noise and, in my case, fill in holes in the foreground matte. It means I don't have to do a manual touch-up procedure in a paint program. I can stay within Primatte. You can set the filter to look for specks in the background if your background isn't quite perfect, or to plug holes in the matte, or to do both. These slidable parameters control how much Primatte looks for specks and holes. But you can also control the gamma of the matte with the histogram. This is going to be the fastest method in my case. Here's how it works. If I move the gamma slider too far, I start to reveal some of the background noise. But conversely, if I move the input white slider, then I can adjust for all these grey pixels in one go. I've got to be careful though, because if I drag too far, I start to affect the edges of the matte. So I need to balance the movement in the input white slider with the tweaks on the gamma slider. Watching the rest of the matte to make sure I don't overdo it. It's your choice really which tools you use to fine-tune the key, but in general a good way of working is to progress down through the controls until you find a tool that specifically fixes your problem. For example, on this shot, there's some green spill from the background on her cheeks. I can fix this in several ways. I can go up to the correction tools and I can choose spill sponge. This lets me draw over the spill using the point sampling method, and the spill is removed. But if I want more control over exactly how much of the spill I want removed, I can scroll down to the composite controls and use the spill killer settings. The composite controls let you adjust how your key sits in with the background. It's obvious with this green spill on the shot that it doesn't fit in with the lighting scheme of the corridor. So I'm going to turn on Spill Killer and select the color mode, which in my case is green. The way to manage these settings is to adjust the range, tolerance and strength sliders all together. If I move the range down to around about 50%, I could then slide up the strength until the green spill begins to disappear. Using this method, I've got lots of control over the exact shade of the spill I'm removing. In this case, I can get a pretty good result just using the range and the strength sliders. I haven't had to adjust the tolerance. It'll depend on your footage, of course. Now with the spill removed, I still need to make this shot fit believably into the background. A great way to do this is to use light wrap to simulate shining some background light onto the foreground figure. I need to select a background layer first, which is the hallway, the corridor shot, on the bottom layer of my comp, and then enable light wrap. This is what it's doing. I'll switch the operation over to show wrap on black, and then I'll just increase the width a bit. Light wrap is wrapping some of the background around the edges of the foreground. This gives the illusion of light from the background shining on my figure, which is selling the composite. There's a series of modes that you can choose to adjust how much light is being wrapped around the edges, and you can choose one to suit your shot. Screen is working okay, that's the default one, but I like the bright highlights that Ad creates, which suggests that her hair would actually be reflecting quite brightly under these circular lights. You can interactively drag on the controls for width and brightness to suit the shot as well. She's still not quite sitting in the shot though, mostly because of the colour balance. The way she's been lit makes her appear much warmer in tone than the grey background. You can adjust for this using the colour matcher in Primatte. This makes the foreground and the background elements appear as if they coexist in the same space, by balancing the foreground element's colours to match the general colour balance of the background layer. The strength slider determines how much the original colours of the foreground are adjusted towards the background colours. For detailed adjustments, you can tweak the highlights, midtones and shadow controls to really fine-tune the colour correction. But there is a quicker way, and that's to colour correct both the foreground and the background layers using an adjustment layer. This is a classic compositing technique. Let's say I wanted to colour this scene in that science fiction style with a contrasty greeny blue look. I can add Magic Bullet Mojo to the adjustment layer, which is great for this sort of effect. The fact that I'm adding it to an adjustment layer means that the colour of both the underlying layers are going to be corrected together. The same colour correction working on both layers means my scene is beginning to work. I might add a bit of camera blur to the background to simulate some depth of field, but the main point is that the keying process was quite painless because of all the tools that are available in Primatte Keyer. This tutorial is just meant to get you started. Primatte Keyer has lots of features that let you tweak and adjust keys until they're perfect. And it also has workflow enhancements, small little nice touches that help you work more efficiently. For example, in the keying section, you can switch off and on the sampling. This allows you to disable the sampling tools, so when you're working in the interface, you don't accidentally resample the image, which can be annoying if you spent time setting it up perfectly. There's a great new feature, Adjust Light, which automatically evens out backgrounds which have uneven lighting. I can best show the effect of this evening out of the background by switching on the split screen view. Now I can see the original foreground on the left hand side of the comp and I've got the new Adjust Light foreground view on the right hand side. I can grab the slider to show more of either of these views. By the way, this is footage from a short film set up by and featuring Joe from the QA department at Red Giant. So here's the original background with some areas that are slightly brighter because of the effect of the spot lighting on the background. And here's the adjusted background with those lighter areas smoothed out. This is nice because Primatte is doing this adjustment automatically for me. It evens out the green screen by blending similar colours in the background screen. And it helps to eliminate the wrinkles and shadows in the background and takes into account more colours in the range of green, reducing the imperfections. I can tweak the effect though with the light strength slider, which is in the advanced section. This controls the broadness of the adjust lighting effect. This is important because having a more even background makes for a better key. As well as protecting the matte, Primatte has features that improve the quality of the key, like median sampling, which you can turn on from within the refinement section, which applies a small median filter around each sample point, which can greatly reduce the influence of noisy pixels. Similarly, the grain controls can help you clean up the image and get a good edge on the matte. They help to clean the background but still preserve the fine edges on the foreground object. And this is important typically when there's a lot of noise, usually caused by film grain. The help documentation that comes with Primatte goes into more detail about all the controls, and it also explains why a particular setting is useful. For example, here's the section about hybrid matte, which is a feature which helps you to improve your matte even if your subject is wearing clothing similar to the background that is being keyed. The notes here show how you can fill in the holes in the matte, as well as using controls like hybrid blur to soften the edges, which is helpful if you have semi-transparent elements on the edge of the matte, like wispy hair. There's all sorts of in-depth information in the help documentation, so I definitely recommend checking it out. It's also worth checking out the keying suite, which ships with Primatte Keyer, as well as Key Correct, which has even more tools for adjusting and refining keys and mattes. And it also ships with Warp, which is a fast way of adding perspective shadows and reflections to footage, without having to go through the rigmarole of setting up 3D cameras and lights. You can use it in a 2D comp, or even on a standard Final Cut timeline. So I hope this intro into Primatte Keyer has been helpful. Certainly have a look at the extra information that comes with the download, which you get even if you're just checking out the trial version. And if you've got any questions, Red Giant has a really helpful support department, which you can access through the redgiant.com website. But until the next time, good luck and have fun!